All right, hey, I want to give you just a little bit of a background on a couple of some of the core aspects of this first chapter because I think it's really important to really understand these four categories before we move forward in this book. And so, let me give you just a couple of things to consider before you read it. And the first thing I want you to consider is how are religious texts authoritative? So, as you well know, if we're looking at religion just in general, there are several different types of religious texts. Some are very, very, very old, 45 or 4,000, 4,500 years old. And there are some that are really quite recent. The Quran, was written probably, in the seventh century. I'm for sure in the seventh century. So that's really not that old. And then if you want to look at some American religions, for example, like the Book of Mormon, is only a couple hundred years old. And so religious texts are really diverse. And so the way in which people think that religious texts are authoritative is equally diverse. So let's focus in on Judaism and Christianity for a second, because I think that this is where a lot of us kind of understand some of this a little bit more deeply. Some people in the reading, will be described as ones who take the Bible literally. And in a sense, for them, for the Bible to be authoritative, for the Jewish and Christian scriptures to be authoritative, one has to understand the text literally. For example, Jesus literally walked on water. He was born of a virgin. God created the world in 6 days. When the Bible says that time stopped, it really did. So on and so forth. So the Bible, like the story, is authoritative because it is dependent upon the story, whatever that story is, being literally, factually true. But the reason I have Little Red Riding Hood up here is that, on the one hand, that story could be read and interpreted quite literally. The story of a little girl wearing a red hood, taking bread and wine, or however the story varies from author to author, to grandma who is sick. And at some point, she's lured off the path, and things start to go downhill. Some stories have like the wolf eating grandma, so on and so forth. So one could argue, well, the story is to be read literally. It's simply a story of a little girl taking bread and wine to sick grandma. But on the other hand, why do we read this story to kids? Is it just, a story to entertain them before bed? Or are there these deeper kind of like metaphorical truths that might be found in the story? For example, this truth that some parents might want to pass on to their kids, that you shouldn't stray from the right path, that the right path in which you should go, but when you start to stray, when you start to look and kind of be tempted off of this path, that's when real destruction happens. Maybe Little Red Riding Hood is a story of the move from like naivete to learning or to understanding. And therefore, it really has multiple meanings and multiple layers. And so when it comes to the Bible, for example, there are going to be some people who think that we should read the creation narratives, plural, in the Hebrew Bible literally. So there are two creation narratives in Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2. They both tell a story, or a unique way of how creation happened. They both, sorry about that text from my wife right there. She's at the grocery store. They both tell a different version of like what God may be like God's nature, so on and so forth. But they both really argue that creation of the world looks like this, that there are three layers of creation: under the ground, on the ground, and then like above the ground. So then there are three types of animals that are below, the earth, so the big old like sea monsters, the ones that are on the earth, animals, just that you and I are aware of, and then like water animals, so alligators and fish, And then there are the animals that are above the earth, and these are the birds. These are water animals too. And they would argue, for example, on day 2, the narrative says that God created a firmament, a firm, flat thing to keep the waters above the water, the dome from falling down on the earth. And I would, at this point, just recommend that you just maybe even pause the video and go read Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2, because you will start to see how very, very different they are. For example, in Genesis chapter 1, what I have up here are really kind of like the first 2 days of creation. The reason that some people think that God created the world in 7 days is because of Genesis chapter 1, which was penned probably sometime in the 6th century BCE by some Jewish people whose temple was just destroyed down in Babylon, or by the Babylonians down in Jerusalem. And so here in day 1, God said, let there be light, and there was light. God saw the light was good. God separated the light from the darkness. These are all patterns that you see in all of the 6 days. And then there's evening, and then there's morning the first day. And then day 2, God said, let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, so on and so forth. So if you read Genesis chapter 1, you're going to notice that Adam and Eve never show up. They're simply not in that story. But what people over time have done is they've taken Genesis chapter 1, which is written by one author, and Genesis chapter 2, which is written by a completely different author. You can see right here, Genesis chapter 2 refers to God as Lord God, Yahweh Elohim, whereas in Genesis chapter 1, the author refers to God, as Elohim. And what they like to do is they like to take these 2 stories and combine them together. But if you read this text right here, this is a whole new, different model of how creation happened. And how can that be? Were the Jews kind of stupid enough to not understand that they're writing 2 narratives side by side? Or could it be that the creation narratives are about more than telling how creation happened? With respect, nobody was there. Nobody knew how creation happened unless God whispered into the ears of these people who were writing this text, hey, psst, this is how it happened. So notice in Genesis chapter 1, God is described in ways that are different than in Genesis chapter 2. In Genesis chapter 1, humans are created in God's image. In Genesis chapter 2, humans are created uniquely with the breath of God, or the breath of life. So I like to kind of stop at this point in the class and say, well, which one is it? Which one's right? And it takes that brave student to be like, well, they both are. Because a lot of theologians describe this literary genre as myth. And if you know anything about myth, myth is profoundly true by the people who tell these stories. What Jews used to do every New Year, when they would all be gathered together, is they would read the creation stories, because the creation story is the Jewish story. Especially Genesis chapter 2, 3, and 4. That is the Jewish story. And if you have questions about that, I would be happy to help you think through that later on. And so, how can these religious texts be authoritative? Well, in the text, you're going to hear some people say that the Bible is to be read literally. You're going to have other people who argue that the Bible is not to be read literally, but it's to be read seriously and taken very seriously. And you're going to see that when these 2 propositions are made, when it comes to the study of science and religion, a lot of new issues are going to arise. So if you have any questions of that, reach out to me, please. The second thing I want you to consider is that what you just heard was not a voice crack. It was, I guess, me being awkward on video. Is this question: are humans the center of the universe? Imagine that for thousands of years, humans thought that we were the center of this whole mess. And what would it have been like when these scientists start to discover that Earth is not the center of the universe? I would even suppose that right now you're probably thinking, yeah, but humans are special. Humans are better than other animals. Humans are unique. Other animals are not. And so let me give these 2 examples for a second. Are hurricanes good? A lot of people would say, no, they're horrible. Why does God allow hurricanes to happen? Hurricanes result over here in the loss of property, in the loss of life, and the damage of of cities and the economic impact. Hurricanes are horrible. And when saying that, they forget and they overlook many of the benefits, especially ecological benefits that hurricanes bring. They do, of course, they bring a whole bunch of water that is really important for ecosystems. One thing that I read is that hurricanes really help remove some of the top layer of dirt to allow some of like the more healthy, more nutrient-rich dirt kind of come to the surface. And there are other ways in which it affects animal life and life of animals in the ocean, so on and so forth. Are forest fires good? Well, if you know anything about forest fires, your answer should be absolutely. But again, people are going to say, well, no, like they result in the loss and the damage of life and property, so on and so forth. So I want you to be a little bit more empathetic whenever we're reading about the move from kind of a human earth-centered view of the universe to a sun-centered view of the universe. That really is going to mess with a lot of people. And I want you to try to be empathetic there. And the final thing I want you to be aware of in this reading are these three themes up here: ontology, the existence of God, and natural theology. Ontology is a philosophical study of being, B-E-I-N-G, where, so you and I are ontological agents for a philosopher because we possess a certain level of beingness. But when it comes to God, there have been attempts to argue, to logically prove that God exists. And these are called ontological arguments for the existence of God. For example, one of the famous ontological arguments goes like this, and this is dependent upon Aristotle, 300 or 400 BCE, and then Aquinas, who was a Christian theologian in the 12th century of the Common Era. And the cosmological argument essentially says, you and I exist because of our parents, and our parents exist because of their parents. And that tree that is living outside of your window exists because of the other trees and the pollen and plant reproduction was one of the hardest things for me in biology. But everything exists. My book exists. My phone exists. My watch exists. This chair that I am sitting on exists. This computer exists because somebody made it. Because something happened to make it. And so everything that exists is contingent upon the existence of something or somebody else. My coffee cup on my desk is contingent upon somebody making that coffee cup. And the argument goes, well, if there is a coffee cup maker, if there's a coffee cup, there must be a coffee cup maker. So if there is a universe, there must be a universe maker. And that universe maker, these philosophers argued, was God. But let me pause for a second. Does that argument, the cosmological argument, prove that God exists? Well, some people may think, that's sufficient evidence. Other people, not so much. So try to set with this for a second, that we cannot prove that God exists, nor can we disprove the existence of God. Okay? We can't prove that God exists, nor can we disprove that God exists. And so there's this whole branch of primarily Christian theology, but it could also be philosophical theology that argues that we can know about God by nature. We look at the universe, and it is profoundly complex, but it sure does seem, according to some, that it's intricately designed, or it's intricately evolved. We look at the human, we look at our genes, we look at life and all of its complexity in our world. And there are some people who make a teleological argument that say, man, this whole thing sure does look like it's designed. It's designed by a designer. And so natural theology is the idea that we can know certain things about a God by just observation and experience. And so I want you to be very aware of some of these themes as you go through this text. That there are multiple ways in which religious texts can be authoritative for many people, that none of us would think that the Jewish model of the creation of the universe is scientifically correct. And yet, you can have Jews and Christians who would clearly say, and please hear this, that the theological truths that come out of these creation narratives are not factual. God didn't get they didn't get the science right, but are profoundly true. That God is powerful, that God is almighty, that God is intimate, experimental, that God is personal and forgiving. That humans are created equal, that humans are created special in the image or the breath of God. And so I want you to use this then as a way to really understand some of the core aspects of this chapter. Again, if it doesn't make sense, email me or hit me up on one of the discussion boards, and we'll make sure to help you out.